We're here tonight to talk about a very interesting fellow from Lancaster's history. Someone that's been widely overlooked probably the last several generations, but he was very commonly known 100 years ago in town. Henry Stedman Nourse, spelled N-O-U-R-S-E. The original family name was Nourse, like you would think of in a hospital setting. But some of the branches of the family started adding the O in the 19th century. I guess they thought it was a little more sophisticated, perhaps. He came from humble means. He was born here in 1831 to Stedman and Martha Howard Nourse, who were not natives to Lancaster, but had come over here from Bolton, which used to be Lancaster until it broke off in 1738. So he was from old Lancaster stock on one of the branches. One of his grandmothers was a Houghton, H-O-U-G-H-T-O-N. So he descended from one of the very earliest settlers here in town, John Houghton, who happens to have the earliest dated stone in the first settlers' burial field, 1684. So his roots went right back to the very beginning in this town. On the Nourse side of his family, he was the fifth great-grandson of a woman named Rebecca Town Nourse. She was the wife of Francis Nourse back in the old Puritan days, living in what we now call Danvers, but back then it was called Salem Village. And she had the unfortunate encounter being accused by that little tart, Ann Putnam, of being a witch. And she was actually convicted, and one of the individuals who was executed on July 19, 1692, they hanged her. She was one of the oldest of the victims of the witchcraft hysteria, and one of the most godly or Christian of the people. And after her execution, it helped get some of the attention of the folks, the authorities in Boston. They started reconsidering this hysteria up there, and they quickly shut it down soon thereafter. But sadly, she lost her life. So he came from early Lancaster stock, early New England stock. Two of his great-grandfathers were Minutemen who marched to Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. So the fellow here was well-rooted in the area and our history as the colonial period and the early American Revolution period. No doubt he grew up here hearing some of the tales and stories of his ancestors, and he certainly fell in love with the history of the area and the town of Lancaster. He grew up here attending the public schools as they were back then in the early 1800s. At that time in New England, Lancaster was very similar to the rest of the area and having what were called district schools. District schools were the local public school. Because we didn't have school buses back then, and there were many pockets of villages and neighborhoods, throughout the town they would have anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen different small, usually one-room schoolhouses. Frequently over the years they would move them depending on the dynamics of the neighborhood where the largest area of children were coming from. And they would meet throughout the fall and winter and spring around the harvest and the planting season and farm chore times, and the children would receive a rudimentary education, reading, writing, arithmetic, and of course history. So he came up here in the Lancaster area. If we had my slides showing, I'd show you the map of his house. His parents were in Bolton originally. They married and they moved shortly thereafter to Lancaster. They built a new house at the foot, almost the foot, but lower end of Sterling Road. Now, if you go up Main Street and you head south towards South Lancaster, past the college, you pass the Prescott Street, the Trolley Stop Pizza, you go past the Southern Maine Conference offices where the camp meeting area is, and you hang that right going up the hill, Sterling Road. You go up that road, 2 houses, and then you'll come to like a horseshoe drive that goes around a large field, which has become a parking area for the camp meeting. The Adventist Conference bought that some years ago. In that empty field stood the Nourse house. It was there many years. The last occupants were 2 spinster sisters who taught, one at Atlantic Union College, the other in the public schools in the area, the Bartlett sisters. And they were living there when, unfortunately, a fire took place, which consumed the building, and they became homeless, and the Nourse house was lost back in the, I think it was the 60s, as I recall. I couldn't find a date for it. So there's nothing left there, sadly, but the blank, empty spot where it once stood. We have no pictures of the house that we can find. The Historical Commission couldn't find any, I couldn't find any, the library didn't have any. So sadly, whatever pictures may have survived either are not identified, or we have never been able to have access to them or learn of their existence. But that's the house that he grew up in. Now, down the road a ways, if you went back down Main Street, headed again like you were going back towards the AUC, there used to be a store in the large house on the corner of Kilbourne Street and Main Street called the John Thurston House. I believe it was the same one where the, for the old timers, where the Burke Oil Building used to be. Now the back section was torn off and redone. My Uncle Jerry Hardy did that in the 80s. I helped working in college part-time with him. But the front section is the original basement. That was a store, and the Thurston family there had a son named George Lee Thurston, and there was also a brother, John I guess it was George Lee. I'm mixing up Thurstons and Washburn, sorry. He became a very close friend of Henry Nourse. Boyhood chums. They went to the public schools together, district school, then later on to Lancaster Academy, not to be confused with South Lancaster Academy, which started in 1882, but Lancaster had an academy before they had a public high school, and it was on the town green. If you turn around, we don't have the slides, but I can show you one picture. The back wall, to the far right, you'll see a white building with a little cupola right by the tree there on the right side, some people out front. That was the Lancaster Academy building. That's how it looked in 1856, not very many years after our Henry S. Nourse would have attended there. He did have a short run also in another academy out in Leicester called Lancaster Academy, which was a very well-known academy in Worcester County from the early 1800s up until the late 1800s. So he was blessed to have a little bit more of an education than some of the farm children and students around here. He actually went to the high school and the academy level. He was known in his youth to be very much a bookworm. He always had his face in a book, he said. And it was funny, he later recalled that, of course, he loved reading, had his face in his book, but by his own account, he said an insatiable love of indiscriminate reading was mistaken by his parents for a love of study. Just because he liked to read, I guess he didn't really like to study. But they all thought this guy should go to college. And so even though his father, who was a carpenter and of modest means, he bent his energies towards putting his boy through college. And in 1849, Henry S. Nourse ended up enrolling at Harvard University, Harvard College down in Cambridge. And lo and behold, his buddy, John Dee Washburn, another friend from town, also enrolled that year. And the two of them went to college together at Harvard, graduated together in 1853. So he had his Lancaster buddy with him, and he did a very good job down there. He wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, but he held his good grades and learned a lot. He just absorbed as much as he could. He had a very keen mind towards mathematics. And as a boy, I mentioned he liked to read. He also loved to he was always making something. He was good with his hands, very tactile and practical. And he loved to romp around the woods and the pastures and explore. He was a curious-minded boy. So after he finished getting his degree at Harvard, he was quickly invited by Professor Baldwin to go to Phillips Exeter Academy up in Exeter, New Hampshire, which was another prestigious prep school at the time, still actually running today. And he became the professor of ancient languages up there. Of course, in those days, there was heavy emphasis on Latin and Hebrew. Today, we don't get so deep entrenched into that. But back then, they were still very astute at Greek as well. And he taught this there for 2 years until 1855. So at that time, we actually took a position down in Taunton at Bristol Academy, where they hired him to be the principal and to continue teaching. So here's our friend, Henry S. Nourse, long-time Lancaster resident, successful Harvard graduate, a principal of a small academy over in Taunton. While he was there, if that wasn't enough for him to be the principal and the teacher of this institution, he started clerking and studying law in his spare time with Mr. Bayliss and John E. Sanford. Now, he wasn't intending to practice law, mind you, but he wanted to learn law. He thought it would help him be better prepared to, I presume, manage the school and face life's challenges. So he held that job for 2 years until finally his health started to wane, I'm sure under the strain of being a principal, being a teacher, and trying to learn law on the side. It wore on his health. His health broke down, and he had what was called neuralgia, bronchial ailments, and dyspepsia, which combined to make his life miserable, he said later. So he took some time off, and he went to the middle and the western states of the United States. So mind you, this is in the 1850s. America was still rather youthful and expanding westward. The gold rush had only been a few years before. There was a big craze to go west, young man. So that's what he did. He went west for a while. And while he was out there, he regained his health and recovered. And in 1858, he came back east and he went and worked for a civil engineering company in Boston. He decided classroom work and teaching work were not his gig. He wanted to do some things that would get him outdoors and help keep his health more vibrant. And of course, he liked to be outdoors. He liked to do things with his hands and explore. So he was a pretty good fit. The company he got his job with was a company called Whitewell and Henrik in Boston. And these are the same people that were in charge of quite an interesting project going on in Boston. It just started at that time. Filling in the Back Bay. Department of Environmental Protection folks will howl if they had something like this come along today. But back then you could do that. You could fill in the Back Bay if you wanted to, and by George they did. So he was working with that particular company, I'm sure, on that project at various capacities. When in 1859 and 1860, he was engaged to help go out to build a railway by the same company apparently had this job. They sent him down to Maryland, along the eastern shore to build a new portion for the Delaware Railway. Again, railroads were in their infancy too. The first railroad to Lancaster only came through in 1845, and that was the Nashua and Worcester Railroad line, which is now the Boston and Maine Railroad that we have going right back here and up towards Clinton. So we're only about a decade into the railroads. They were still building these new modern technological advancements at the time, and it took a civil engineer to calculate safely large bridges and railroad track beds. So he was up to his eyeballs in this, helping to build that section of the Delaware Railway. When in the middle of it all, in 1860, down in Maryland, what do you suppose started happening? Civil War. He was at the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on your perspective. But sure enough, he was interrupted by the troubles which culminated in the Civil War. Being a dutiful Northerner, he immediately wanted to join the Grand Old Army and fight for the Union. He came back to Boston, and he sat and waited, thinking his engineer skills were sure to get him a good position in one of the Massachusetts regiments. Unfortunately, he waited and waited and waited, and nothing came or presented itself. So finally, one of his friends out in Chicago, and I think it may have been Thurston, contacted him and said, the Douglas Brigade needs you. We're gonna do some work with railroads here. We need to shore up for the Civil War. Would you please join our outfit? Come to Chicago. So out he went. Well, it didn't quite turn out the way he planned. That outfit didn't pick him up and didn't materialize into anything, but the 55th Illinois Infantry was happy to grab him and hired him, and he enlisted with them in 1861, October 31st, Halloween. And he had his training out in the Benton Barracks in Missouri, and he joined this 55th Illinois Infantry, and he stayed with this outfit throughout the war. While he was in this infantry, They were part of Sherman's Yazoo expedition, you know, General Sherman. They saw some very serious engagements. In fact, he was in 30 of the 31 different battles that this particular outfit was engaged in. So he was really in it for the duration of the war, and he must have seen some horrific action of fighting. At Shiloh, the Battle of Shiloh, he was wounded slightly. Thankfully, it wasn't severe, but some shrapnel from a shell wounded his ankle, and I guess he did suffer a little bit from hobbly effects of that for the rest of his life. So at the end of the war, he was mustered out on August 14, 1865. So that was a pretty long career from the start in 1861 all the way to the end in 1865. Very dedicated soldier he was. Having been a great model citizen, teacher, student teacher, and then a soldier, he again returned back to his native state. He came here for shortly, but then he settled. We have success.
You get your information into the USB, and then
I think
if it's all on there right now.
Hold on, I think I put it on.
Okay,
I think
sorry.
I did.
Right here.
So he ended up being hired by the Pennsylvania Steel Company back out to Pennsylvania area in 1866, September. He was actually appointed the resident engineer with this company, and he began construction on the Bessemer Steel Works near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He held this position until 1868 when, surprise, surprise, they finished the Bessemer Steel Works project, and he was immediately hired on to be the superintendent at this said project. So he did accept that, and he kept that position from June 1st of 1868 until he resigned on January 1st, 1874. During that time, he did something rather interesting. His buddy, George Thurston, who had beckoned him out to Chicago, another Lancaster native who had gone west with his ambitions, who actually was killed, sadly, on December 15, 1862, during the war, early in the war. He had been married, and he left a widow back east. And lo and behold, our Henry S. Nourse apparently liked her well enough to marry her. So he married one of his best friend's widows, and her name was Mary Baldwin Whitney Thurston. She was born in 1833, and she was his wife until she died in 1899. Incidentally, she was born in Cambridge, and she was married to George L. Thurston, who I mentioned. And his, let me see if I get this correct in my notes. There's so many interconnections. I want to get it properly. Where was my first? Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, he also had attended Lancaster Academy as a child. So Henry Nourse, John Dee Washburn, and George Lee Thurston were all chums at the Lancaster Academy. Mrs. Thurston, who became Mrs. Nourse, bore one child to the union, a young daughter named Elizabeth, whom Henry apparently named after his sister Elizabeth, who had died young. Unfortunately, she was born in 1872, as I recall. They were married in 1870 here in Lancaster. This child didn't last the year, and she died the same year she was born. That was the only, that and possibly one other young child were the only offspring Henry S. Nourse ever had, and sadly they didn't live to maturity. So, and his sister, who died young, never married. So the Stedman Nourse and his wife Martha, his two children, didn't bear any lasting grandchildren or family legacy in that branch, sadly. In 1874, August of that year, Henry S. Nourse and his wife of now about 4 years, almost 4 years, decided they were going to take a trip to Europe. I think his health was waning a little bit again. He wanted to have a trip. So they went by ship, of course, back then, and they went to tour Europe, good old Victorian grand tour. And they went to England, trying to find my list here of places they visited.
All right, I need to hear.
All right, I'm going to do a fast rewind just so you can see some of the images that went along with our talk so far. So we have here the map. I need to enlarge that. How do I enlarge that? Oh, I know what I need to do. I need to go to
The upper right corner will get you there.
and slideshow and current slide.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So we have here Sterling Road, Main Street. That's going to Clinton. That's going up to Lancaster Center. The house was down here in the corner, almost across from where Parker Road comes out. That's the footprint of the house. I wish it was a little clearer for you, but that is where the Nourse house had been. And here's an enlargement of it. H.S. Nourse, civil engineer. This is from an 1898 map, Richard's map of Worcester County. It also shows on the Beers 1870 map, but this was a better image, so I put this one up for you to see. So this gives you an idea. They also had family across the street. He owned the house there. This was later. I think that might still be there. I'm not sure if that's one of the houses there still or not. This one's gone. This is the one that burned. The drive is still here though, and this is all parking lot during the camp meeting time. This is where Sandy's restaurant would be right here. If that gives you a little idea, Mill Street. So I think you have a idea.
So is that Middle Road, Parker Road?
This here is
Yeah.
Parker Road,
Yeah,
correct.
that's us.
Right here, Parker Road.
Oh,
Yeah. And Sterling Road, this is going up the hill actually, Sterling Road.
Mhm.
So you get an idea of the house here. They have the main house, the L, and look like a carriage house or a barn all attached, typical New England layout. So that's where he would have grown up. The store I mentioned would have been up, let's see here, that's Narrow Lane, would have been up just a little bit more here, was where that Thurston store, John G. Thurston store, his childhood buddy George Thurston had lived, and of course he married George's widow. That was the biggest store in South Lancaster at the time, so the Thurstons were rather well-known folks in town. This is the picture of the Thurston House, as it would have looked back during the days of Henry S. Nourse. So that would have been his in-law's house. Am I getting that right? His wife's in-law's house. Thank you. Forgive me, I'm crossing my wires. Here's our man during the time of the Civil War. He's in uniform. He has quite the big burly beard. He looks like he wants to go outdoors, doesn't he? And large hands too. So this is from somewhere between, I'd say, 1861 and 1865, because he is in his uniform. And most of the soldiers would sit for their portrait before the battles got along, as they wanted to have a memento in case something happened to them, send back to their family. Here we have the town common from 1856, again showing the Lancaster Academy. This is the original town hall, they called it Town House, which also stood on the green. It was built in 1848 and torn down when they made the current town hall in 1907. And of course you recognize, I'm sure, the 1816 First Parish Church, also known as the Bullfinch Church. Now, Leicester Academy is an engraving from around 1839, where he had attended school for a short while. He taught at the Phillips Exeter Academy. This is from 1899 advertisement. Of course, the school didn't change too much, I'm sure, in that period. Now, we'll get to him in just a minute. Anybody know who this guy is? Think about that, see if you can figure it out. It's a trick question for you. Bonus points. So, I gotta remember just where I was at when we get a tour of Europe. So he went to Europe with his wife. They went to England, Holland, Belgium, Italy, 6 months in Italy. Toured all around Europe, had a grand time. Then they came back. When he came back, we also went to Scotland and France. He came back around July 1875, and his health was much better. And he got a call to go to Missouri to be the manager of new steelworks out there. But he had his fill of steelworks by then. And he says, no, I'm going to settle back down in my parents' house in Lancaster, which he did. So he returned to Lancaster with his wife, and he settled here and lived here ever thereafter, until his passing, of course. Now, when he came back here, he had come back around 1875, 76 range. Some things had changed. One of the things that had changed was a new fellow had blown into town. A fellow that was born in Connecticut, but had a lot of associations with Winchington. He was a minister of the Congregational Church in the 1860s for several years. His name was Abijah P. Perkins Marvin. And that's who we have on the screen here, engraving of Mr. Abijah, or Pastor Abijah P. Marvin. He was the minister. My family went to the Congregational Church on my father's side, so they had him for a pastor back then. He was an interesting fellow. He loved history. He had taught also in the past. He was strongly affiliated with some of the schools, like he helped with the Murdoch School up in Winchington. He was an avid supporter of being a Congregationalist of Cushing Academy in Ashburnham, which was begun by the Congregationalists. And he became pastor here. He lasted a few years, and then for some reason he was dismissed. I haven't been able to figure out why. If it was his decision, their decision, I presume it was more their decision than his decision. But he stayed in the area. His two daughters, Catherine and Mary, continued on at the church. They were very active in the church. They taught Sunday school for years and years and years, dying in the last one dying, I guess, in the 1970s. And while he was here in 1876, the United States had the bicentennial celebrations coming on, 1875, 76. It was voted for him to write the history of Lancaster. Now, Nourse had just barely gotten back, or I hadn't quite got back, I guess I should say, because he was touring Europe with his wife on their way back. But the vote went with the town to appoint him to write the history of Lancaster. He had written one on Winchington, and he had also written, there was another one he'd written on a religious one. He had at least 2 books out there. So he was quite happy to take this job. Even though he wasn't a native, he felt he was up to the task. So it took him several years. It didn't come out in time for the bicentennial. Do you know what year Marvin's history got printed? 4 bonus points. 1879. So by the time it came out and was printed, and every house in town, by the way, was given a copy from the town. The town paid for it. Every last house in town received 1 copy. Nourse was well established back in his parents' house by the time it came back. He picked it up with much enthusiasm, I'm sure, loving the local history as he did, and he started reading. And the more he read, the more his eyes rolled. Marvin did a great job, considering he was not a native, but there were many errors and mistakes, or quite a few. And being a civil engineer and a native and a stickler for detail, Nourse was quite taken back by some of the errors in there. So he took on an ambitious project. He had a sort of a polite but gentlemanly contest, tug of war, if you will, rivalry with Marvin. And he took Marvin's book, big fat book, and he divided it up, took it apart, tore it apart at the binding, and he started reassembling it, section after section, page after page, with corrections, handwritten notes, annotations, supplemental pamphlets, documents, photographs, and he reassembled that. By the time he was done, guess how many volumes he had from the original fat, like 3.5-inch book? We had another fat 3.5-inch book 4 times over. So Henry S. Nourse's annotated history of Marvin is what I call the Bible for Lancaster history. If you really, really, really want to check the details on the town history, consult this work. More often than not, you'll find some of the details that Mr. Nourse added that you won't find readily anywhere else. How did he do this? How did he know all these details? Well, when he came back in 1875-76 and settled here, he started working for an oil company out of Boston, East Boston, called Maverick Oil Company. And along the way, he decided he wanted to give back to his town, his society. And he ran for and successfully was elected to the State House as a representative for the 5th Worcester District. So Captain Nourse, which was the title he had acquired during the service of the military career, short-lived Civil War military career, he became representative nurse. And he served from 1883 up until around 1885 in this capacity. And then he thought, well, gee, I think the folks on the other side of the State House are having more fun. So he ran for senator for the same district, 5th Worcester District, which Lancaster was a part of back then. And he was again successfully elected 1885 to 1886 to serve as a senator. No doubt those years learning law way back in his youth paid off a little bit for him. While he was in Boston, serving in the state legislature, during his spare time, and he was on several important committees, by the way, too. He was on the committees for roads and bridges, labor, and also public service. He was not only on them, but he chaired those committees. He was the chairman. During his extra time, he wanted to be a good public servant. So while some of his colleagues were down at the pubs and the theater and various and sundry activities, he had his nose over to the courthouse and the Registry of Deeds in Middlesex County nearby in Cambridge, because that's where the early Lancaster records were. Lancaster is part of Worcester County today, the oldest town in Worcester County. Worcester County didn't happen, or didn't get created until 1731. Prior to that, we were Middlesex County. So the earliest records for Lancaster at that level, at the probate and Superior Court and Registry of Deeds levels, are all down at the repositories in Cambridge. He spent hundreds and hundreds of hours poring over all these details, most intimately and intricately. His civil engineering skills, again, honing in on precision and accuracy. And because of that labor of love, we have been able to have preserved for our history so many details that would have otherwise either been lost or probably never hunted down by anybody else. And he gathered all of this information together meticulously into several books, and he also used that, no doubt, when he was rewriting and annotating Marvin's History of Lancaster. So he was a scholar to the core on his seriousness with history, and all of Lancaster has since benefited. In fact, his books are still some of the most widely used books for any Lancaster published books. Genealogists, people researching their house, general historians, all are ever so grateful and frequently consulting the work that he did. In 1886, he also became the trustee of the Worcester Insane Hospital, the lunacy asylum in Worcester, and he was a trustee there for 2 terms of 6 years, 12 years. Again, he was very committed to the idea and concept of service and improving society. In 1890, he was part of a small handful of people that actually organized the, I've got to remember to say it correctly because the name has changed, the Free Library Commission. And that's now known today as the, Emily, please help me.
Massachusetts Board of Library Committee.
Massachusetts Board of Library Committee.
He was up first.
He was, yeah. In fact, they have an award that they give out to this day in his name and honor. He was very forward-thinking for his time, not just with grand ideas of let's help the world, but very practical, down-to-earth, rubber meets the road mechanisms and ideas and organization to improve the services of such things as the lunacy hospital, the insane asylum, the libraries, not just in Lancaster, but for the entire Commonwealth. He helped organize what today we take for granted, but he pioneered these concepts, which helped make Massachusetts one of the leading states in public library performance and service. He also was key in organizing the Massachusetts Military Historical Society, which still operates today. Having been a soldier in the Civil War and having a keen interest in preserving the history and memories of his comrades, including his fallen friend Thurston, he helped establish this important institution, which we have still today. He wrote, co-authored with a friend of his, A History of the 51st Regiment of Illinois. I mentioned he wrote a number of books on Lancaster. Harvard, Massachusetts, which was the first town to break off of Lancaster in 1832, wanted a history of their town. And who did they ask? Henry S. Nourse. So even though we didn't have him writing the original book for Lancaster's history, the early chapters of Harvard's history are a very heavy reference source for Lancaster history too, because that was the origin of Harvard as well. He was an incredibly productive person and a very kind man. Some of the things I most admired about him reading, I mean, there's so many more things. He was a member of all kinds of societies, the least of which probably is the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. How many are familiar with the American Antiquarian Society? That is one of the most prestigious museums and libraries of its kind in the world. It was founded in the early 1800s by Isaiah Thomas, who brought his press from Boston during the early days of the Revolution to Worcester, where it would be safer and out of harm's way from the warring British. And he was the publisher of the Massachusetts Spy. And he and his friend, a fellow you might have heard of, Thomas Jefferson, helped establish with other colleagues the Worcester-based American Antiquarian Society. They had the largest collection of published material and manuscripts for early American imprints and publications in the world. Amazing collection at our fingertips, and there's a lot of Lancaster history there too. He was an active member of this organization, and when he passed away in 1903 in November, sadly, quite unexpectedly, just a few days prior, he had given a speech, a presentation in memory of one of his dear oldest friends who had just died a short while before that, John Dee Washburn. And John Dee Washburn, by the way, was the brother of Colonel Francis Washburn, another American Civil War soldier for whom our local GAR chapter was named after, and died at the end of the Civil War and is buried up in North Village Cemetery. And he was quite the hero in the Civil War as well. We've got other presentations on him. So all of these people were contemporaries and friends. John Dee Washburn was the ambassador for a while to France and Paris. He traveled in very high social, economic, and political circles. So these were no lightweights that our friend Henry S. Nourse was very close friends with. But sadly he passed away in November of 1903. When I got so used to just talking about it, you think this is a picture of his passport when he and his wife, copy of it when they went to Europe. When he did his annotations, by the way, some of his notes are rather comical. He was definitely a bit chagrined and a bit pointed in some. We have one example here. He says, purely conjectural, often, and full of errors, I am sure. Signed H. Another one of his comments here, and this is interesting because it talks of the library. In 1731, the town voted that Samuel Willard's complete body of divinity should be brought and kept in the meeting house. And this would have been the fourth meeting house, I believe, which was the predecessor to our current fifth meeting house. Should be brought and kept in the meeting house for the town's use, so that any person may come and read therein as often as they shall see cause. This was a public library, though excluded from Mr. Marvin's careless definition. There are public reference libraries as well as circulating libraries. So you get an idea. He was a little snidey in some of his comments. Wasn't bashful about expressing his opinion. He also became a trustee for the Lancaster Public Library, which we now know as Thayer Memorial Library. Of course, in 1890, I mentioned he helped pioneer the statewide management of the public library systems. But he began his roots here in town, and he served 25 years as a trustee to the Lancaster Public Library, which we now know as Thayer Memorial Library. And this is about how it looked in 1903 when he passed. We had cupola then. We had a new facade in the front, the 1888 stacks. The 1929 children's wing had not been added on yet. Neither had the northern, was it 1990? 98 southern wing, new edition. But this is our same library that we're in today, right now, and that's how it looked around the time of his passing. He was, of course, as I mentioned, very involved with the American Antiquarian Society, which is a modern photograph of the facility. Upon his death, he was buried alongside his wife and by his father and his mother up at the Middle Cemetery. just next to the Bigelow Gardens on Main Street. And this is a photograph of his gravestone with the American flag in the stand, noting that he was a Civil War veteran, the GAR star. Now, I've got a funny little story to tell you about him. There's so many other things I can say, I don't want to bore you to tears. But I do want to emphasize a few things before I tell my funny anecdotal story. Some of the things I most admire about this man, he grew up in a town with some very affluent people. The Thayer family was well established at that point, one of the wealthiest families in the state. The Parker family had come and been established by the time he reached his maturity, and others in town. And these were his friends and his colleagues. He came from rather humble means. His dad was a carpenter, family of farmers over in Bolton, and also some in Lancaster. But he put his mind to his studies and his reading. He put his heart and his hand to his work, and he was very diligent to excel and promote his lot in life. And he didn't do it for himself. He did it for his family and his community, which is a very, I think, a very telling testimony to the kind of man that he was. And he returned ever and always to his beloved Lancaster, where he's still buried and resting. It seems he had a little sense of humor, too, at times. If I can read this to you here. Forgive me while I put my little glasses on so I can see it better if I can find them. Yesterday was the Atlanta Community College constituency meeting. As you know, they're having some troubles there, but the good news is, even though the current academic program has been suspended and they're no longer offering classes this year, there's very real hope that an organization may be coming on board, an Adventist organization, to turn a good portion of the campus into an English as a second language school. And we're also talking with a couple of sister institutions, Andrews University in Michigan, the Theological Seminary for the Adventists, Loma Linda University out in California, which is a medical institution for the denomination. And there's a very real possibility we will have some collaborative programs return to the campus under their auspices, but here in South Lancaster down the road. So we're hoping that that will continue to unfold the way it's looking like it shall. And of course we have our former AUC president right here, Dr. Cousin Dorman Wendt, my distant cousin, and some of yours too, by the way. Back in the early days of the school, when it was just still South Lancaster Academy, which started in 1882, the Nourse family was not too far over from the academy. A couple of roads over, you saw the map. And apparently, one particular day, some interesting shenanigans were afoot, and they crossed the paths of Henry S. Nourse. I'll read to you from Rowena Purden's book, That New England School. She was in the first graduating class of 1888. She returned and taught many years until her death in the 1950s at AC. She wrote the first history of the college and the academy. She wrote here, the accompanying picture shows the entire school in 1892 when Professor Cavaness was in charge. He stands near the faculty who are seated in the front row with the students grouped behind him. Among them were many young lads who were sometimes quite a problem to the teachers, for they were often getting themselves into difficulties, typical students. George Hill and Parker's woods and pond were frequent playgrounds for them. Off the campus, often a secluded area, good place for some mischief. One Sunday, two of these boys, sons of foreign missionaries, found an old kettle in the bottom of the pond in the woods, which gave them the idea of cooking a dinner there. Bringing onions, potatoes, salt, etc. to the pond, they built a fire and hung their kettle over it to cook. Some other lads joined them, one of whom fished in the pond for more material for the soup. Meanwhile, now mind you, this is a vegetarian institution. Meanwhile, Senator Nourse, who lived not far away, seeing the smoke rising in the woods, quickly arrived on the spot, demanding that every spark of the fire be extinguished. He told the boys he would prosecute to the full extent of the law. Now, of course, he was, at this point, probably looking a little more like this, a little more bearded and senior, and certainly formidable. Of course, he does have that gentle expression, though, I will say. So, too frightened to know what to do next, they rushed back to the academy where they told one of their teachers what had happened. He advised them to go back to the senator and ask his forgiveness. With fear and trembling and slow steps they went. At first, the senator was stern. Then he asked, "What were you boys doing there anyway?" And one of them lads replied hesitatingly, "We were going to make some turtle soup." Whether the man remembered that they were pupils in a vegetarian school or the frightened looks on their faces amused him, he laughed. Realizing that his ammunition was lost, his attitude changed, and he began to ask the brothers about their parents. He even invited them to come to see him again and offered to help them in their arithmetic problems. The other boys involved were advised also to go to the senator and confess. They did and were forgiven, and the boys were all in that picture mentioned before. So he had a kind heart to him, too, mischievous boys trying to make some turtle soup. Thank you for coming. Does anybody have any questions? I'll do my best to answer. There's so much more to talk about, but yes.
The guy who wrote the first history?
Marvin, yes.
Yeah. Why did he remain alive when he had finished his work?
Good question. If I recall correctly, he died in the 1880s. I don't think Nourse quite finished his annotated thing until more around the 1890s, because some of the items that were glued as I've been that's the Bible. I've been in there many times. So I recall some of the latest newspaper clippings and contents were from the 1890s. So I think that it probably was kept quiet out of politeness until after he had passed, the minister. Incidentally, too, the Clinton item, which was originally the Clinton Current, started publication in the 1860s. And during the 1880s and 90s, several times there was some discussions about history, and Nourse could not help but speak up. And it inspired him to write a lot of history down, the history of our hotels, our taverns. He had different themes. He had ongoing series, but he never signed them by his name. He signed them Tohonto. So when you see the old newspapers where it's Tohonto, that's Henriette's Nourse. And thankfully, not only do we still have them preserved in our newspaper collection, but he cut and pasted most of them in scrapbooks. Besides the annotated history, which I really I cannot say enough what a gift that is to our town and our history, and so many others with genealogical connections to the town. He also had a notebook that he made meticulous notes on early family genealogies. And he really went into great detail thanks to his familiarity with the wills and the probate that he studied, and also the land records and other sources when he was in Boston. He took the time to visit families, and he consulted with them, and they opened their hearts and home to him. They let him copy things from the family Bibles and notes and diaries. So some of the material on occasion that he has, we have no other reference to it now other than what he has penciled in with his annotated notes. He also pioneered the concept of saving not just the grand history of the town minutes and the records, but the mundane and the ordinary common history of the town. And he assembled what he called Lancasterian scrapbooks, which we have, I think, 9 volumes of. Yes. Fascinating collection of Lancaster history, beginning in objects and items that he started receiving from the 1700s, long before he was born, when people gave them to him, and they're glued in carefully, all the way up until the time of his death. And again, there are some objects in there that you will find nowhere else on the planet today. And tremendous foresight that he had for us today. He even has the opening exercises programs for South Lancaster Academy, where the little Turtle Soup Boys came from a few years later. So he was very diligent. He tried to include all the groups and societies, all religions. He was very broad-minded and accepting in his thoughts. And we really are indebted to him today for so much information. Yes?
How close to us does his history get?
He died in 1903, so it went right up till about that time. I think there's one or two, one of the volumes might have had a few more things inserted after his death, But
He died unexpectedly.
he died
He wasn't
unexpectedly,
sick or anything.
November 14, 1903. He was in the 70s because he was born in 1831.
Lancastriana has more things up into the 20s and the 30s.
Right, people continued that
Yes.
after. And he gave that, being a good trustee, he gave this collection to the town. He also had books on all the Lancastrian towns. There weren't as many volumes, but there's one, Boltania, Berlinia, Lemons, all the Latin names for all the towns around here. And again, inside each one are some scraps and information on those towns. Very thorough, very amazing. Yes.
I just wanted to mention the annotated history he gave to the library. And when we were applying for a grant, which would allow it to be digitized and conserved, and I think, John, you were there, we went to some other people to get a letter of support for the grant. And so we went over to the Antiquarian Society, and the director there said, well, we have one of those.
Yeah, Tom
And,
knows.
and,
He said, "You've got
and
one."
Joe said, well, no, there's only one. And so we brought our 4 volumes, and he had a single volume, and another person had a single
Yeah.
volume. And he had actually, he must have early on just made corrections. Some of them are like crossed out and corrected right in the text. But when he saw the 4, he goes like, oh no, this is nothing like it.
We blew them
Yeah.
out of the water.
And we did get that grant, which was a $30,000 grant that's administered by the MBLC, which is the Board of Library Commissioners. But it's federal money that's voted in our, when you hear about Congress voting on the budget, there's a very tiny percentage of our federal budget that goes to museum and library services. And those, it's called Library Technology and Services Administrative Act or something. That's where the money came from. So I just wanted to
Yeah, it
mention,
was
and that's what's
30,000.
So it's
sort of
never
on
digitized?
display. Huh? Yes,
Just got done.
And
just
so
months ago.
that's what we set up in the current topics case, but very shortly, within a week or two, we'll put a link because they provided, they took photos of everything, high quality imaging, but we also have a PDF version, so you can at least do the PDF searching. If we really wanted to have keyword searching, we'd have to, I don't know, crowdsource transcribing, because,
But,
which wouldn't be bad. It's just fun. You can just like open it anywhere and see, like John said, the little comments.
Oh yeah, a lot of comments. This was a major undertaking. We were really, really fortunate to get $30,000 grant on this. We were still short a little bit, and thankfully the foundation, I think the Friends stepped up and closed the gap with another $10,000. So this is a huge achievement for researchers, the library in general here, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do this with the Lancastriana scrapbook collection next, perhaps. I say we, I don't know, trustee to the end of the month still, or the end of the election.
And there's also many other handwritten things. So some of his other books are up there.
He had the handwritten notes on the genealogies, which were very helpful. Later, another minister at the church, Dr. Frederick Weiss, built off of that and expanded it even more because he had access to more information later on in the 1950s, 40s and 50s. But just amazing amount of stuff. One of the most interesting things, though, that I discovered when I was checking up for this presentation, I always assumed, because I descend from nurses in Bolton, that there must have been a link somewhere there. Well, I found out, indeed, there is. Henry S. Nourse was my 3rd cousin, 6 times removed. So that and the pat in the back will get you a smile. But thank you so much for coming. Was there any other question? Oh, yes, right here.
I just bought out a few of his books, the military annals, the early records. I didn't get the death registry yet because that's more like factual.
Birth, death, and marriage. Yeah.
And I think I did download the Lancaster Supplemental A. Does that sound correct?
Yeah.
You said there's a lot of those supplements?
He called some, I just noticed this only because I put the display up, but some of his supplements for books, He also called Lancastriana.
But are they
which are-
digitized or here?
No,
Oh, they would be here.
Yes.
He did one, it was a small thin work
Yeah.
called Lancastrian, I think 2. And that was basically a bibliography, and it's very extensive
Yeah.
bibliography of everything and anything that was published by a Lancaster author or about Lancaster or in Lancaster up until around 1899.
And I would find that
Whenever
if I
he
came
published
back
it.
here.
We have a copy of that in our special collection.
There's just one last question. I do a lot of, well, just novice, 2 years into the genealogy, but I was gonna get that Elijah Marvin book, but Barnes and Noble didn't have it, and
You can find it
They're
online. It's
online,
been Google
yeah.
scanned.
Yeah.
just keep.
Yeah,
They're
Marvin's,
online.
yeah,
And there might even be a
It's free,
digital
uh,
archive.
Yeah, free.
online.
yeah.
Yeah.
Though I think I will stop using it very much.
Well, after that, if, sounds
we
like
get it
he
out.
built.
It's still a good source to go to. I don't want you to be thinking there's many good things in there. It's just that, you know, Mr. Civil Engineer, Precision Man,
I'll
Nurse,
buy these books, and I think I'll go online.
really fine-tuned, edited through.
Archive.org to
But
this.
there's still a tremendous amount of useful material just in Marvin's book alone.
I've done a little bit of
I
everything between New England Genealogical Society,
don't want to scare you away from it. It's still a very good work.
and I like doing stuff.
But once you're finished with that, if you want to fine-tune it, then go see what Nurse had to say. Yeah.
I've been to the Historical Commission, too. I like to visit the historical societies and presentations like yours. I like to,
You're Mr. Allen?
yes.
Well, nice to meet you in person.
Something.
I know you're on the Society of Early Lancastrian Families Facebook group. Thank you.
I'm a swamp guy like Henry. I like to be out in the woods.
Stomping
Well,
around.
and one thing he also did, he put pages that were from a certain perspective. Like when I was trying to find out about abolitionism in Lancaster, you can find the page in Marvin where he talks about people giving sermons and stuff. But then Marcia says, oh, but Henry Nourse has this page where he listed, starting back at the founding of the town, who had slaves, how many there were, they became free right away, look at the population, and he went all through. So that was just like cross-reference to
Oh,
other
yes,
places.
yes.
So
Getting the
he'll pick a
source
topic
documents.
and he'll cross-reference and index, and that's what
Yeah,
makes
so
it so.
even though there were certainly some mistakes, most
Yeah.
of what Nurse did wasn't so much corrective annotation, but
Yeah.
additional.
Amplifying it.
Yes.
Yes,
yeah.
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.